Now, for more on this, we are being joined by James Jackson. He's a journalist and a political analyst in Germany, and he's joining us live from Berlin. Welcome to the broadcast, James. Just today, Sweden said that it has fulfilled all demands put forward by Turkey for joining NATO, and on the same day, a protest has been permitted where the Muslim holy book of Quran could be burned. Given that a similar event led to a breakdown in negotiations with Turkey, what is Stockholm exactly thinking?
Well, you have to remember that this was not a political decision. This was a decision by the courts. But I think you're right to point out the huge tension between Sweden and Turkey and within Sweden, because for their own security, they want to join NATO. Along with their neighbour Finland, they turned their back on decades of neutrality to try and join NATO. That, of course, caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But at the same time, Turkey, which has the second largest military in NATO, has been blocking their accession. And some Swedes would argue been trying to extract more and more from them. So you have to remember that the main demand of Turkey has been to extradite Kurdish activists. The Turkey government of Erdogan would call them PKK terrorists, people who they claim are associated with the PKK Kurdish militia. So Sweden has a really tough time because they want to protect their rule of law. They have to follow their own legal system. They can't follow the legal system or the norms of another country like Turkey. But as you mentioned, we saw in January when a far-right protester burned a Quran, we saw massive crowds in Istanbul and across Turkey, but at the Swedish embassy.
All right, we seem to have lost James there. We will be trying to connect back with him. But for those of you who are just joining in, we are getting some big news from Sweden that the police authorities in the country have granted permission for a protest where protesters have said that they might burn the Muslim holy book of Quran. Now, these are contentious times, and this also comes at a time when Sweden is trying to get its NATO membership bid a green light from all the countries. We are being told James has joined us live on this broadcast. James, if you could continue what you were saying.
Yes, sorry about that. Last time in January, it was by a Swedish-Danish far-right activist who wants to do this. But interestingly, this time, the AFP has reported that it was an Iraqi refugee who wants to burn the Quran in protest. So should Sweden clamp down on this man's freedom of speech? I think that the police in Stockholm wanted to block this protest, but then it was overruled by an appeals court. So Sweden are having a really tough time of deciding how far the rule of law and freedom of speech have to go and how far geopolitical considerations can play in domestic law. And I think that's to do with not just this case, but also the extraditions against of Kurdish activists and community members, and who Turkey would call PKK terrorists.
Right, James. Now, you're right to mention that Sweden is not obliged to go by any other country's rule or law but its own. But we also need to make sure that we bring in the point of diplomacy here. Diplomacy cannot work from one end. We are definitely expecting a reaction from Turkey and other Muslim countries as well. I want to ask you, what kind of a reaction are you expecting from Ankara at this moment?
Yes, so I think that this could be, the timing is very, very sensitive because it's just about to come July, and in July there is the much awaited NATO summit in Vilnius. Now, previously, a lot of commentators had said that they expected Erdogan's government to give the green light to Sweden's accession to NATO at the summit or just ahead of the summit, of course, after his recent landslide re-election in the second round. And there's a lot of Turkish, as well as Swedish internal and domestic politics, there's also Turkish domestic politics. So I think Erdogan, even though this was his worst result, he was still re-elected and did much better than the polls showed. So he could be on a high at the moment. He could be showing his supporters what they want, and what they want is Turkey to stand against the West sometimes and to be a strong state representing Muslim interests. I think we've seen that in more and more in increasing years. I don't think the government of Sweden will be happy about this, but they can't overrule the courts. That's the whole point of the separation of power between executive and legislative. So they can't necessarily tell the courts not to, or it would at least be very tricky for them to.
All right, James, before I let you go, reports suggest that far-right extremism is on the rise in Sweden. We also saw an instance this January, also pointed out by you. We are seeing more and more manifestations, demonstrations and marches across Sweden. I want to ask you, what does this mean for the right-wing wave that we are seeing, especially in Western Europe, but also in parts of Europe otherwise? Like, what does it mean for an entirety of Europe?
There absolutely is an increase in not just power and electoral success, but also normalization of the far right. So in Sweden, the biggest party in the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament right now, is the Sweden Democrats, who are, most would say, a far right nationalist Swedish party. We saw in Germany, where I'm joining you from, the first electoral victory of the Alternative for Deutschland, another far-right grouping, although, albeit this was in a very small local election, but still it was, a game changer, the first of its kind in post-war history. And in Spain, coming up, we have the Spanish elections, where we could see the Vox party, another far-right party, enter into government with the People's Party, the PP, which is the normal conservative party. So I think across Europe, we are seeing more of a tolerance towards the far right by the political mainstream, rather than entering into grand coalitions of the centre-left and the centre-right, as is common in Germany. Many conservative parties are happy to rely on the votes of the far right in Parliament, and that's the exact agreement that we see in Sweden, in the Swedish Parliament. In terms of right-wing extremism, that is a problem. It is a growing problem. Of course, it's not completely new. The 90s were a particularly violent time for right-wing extremism here in Germany, but we are seeing the rise of the AfD, particularly in the East. So there are many cases where it would be tough for the Conservatives to form a government without the AfD in upcoming state elections. So you are completely right in that Europe, the far right is rising. It's a big story, and this is going to potentially set alight more far right protests. Although it is, interestingly, the Quran burning this time will be by an Iraqi refugee themselves rather than the far right activists. So we'll have to see how that develops.
All right. Thank you for getting us all those insights, James, on this very sensitive issue. Thank you for joining us on this broadcast.
Thank you.